My name is Larry Gant, and I'm faculty at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, where I teach community policy and community practice. Today, I'm going to be talking about visualizing social policies for social change. And the purpose and the goal of this particular presentation is threefold. First of all, it's to help policies more tangible and real. Second, to help guide the thinking of policy change. And then third, to visualize the processes and the systems underlying these policies and change strategies. Before we go into the how about this, let me provide a very brief definition of social policy because it's always so easy for me to forget that in my life, in my day-to-day work, of course, people have several core definitions of policy, but people coming into social work frequently, unless they've been involved in policy work, they have no idea what policy really is. And so to summarize it very, very simply, it's a kind of a regularized, simple response or solution to a social problem or issue. And that's really important. It's a cure or an approach to resolving a problem or an issue. And it's regularized, which means it doesn't change an awful lot. When you explain it from one person to another, those individuals understand and they can also share what that policy is. Now, policies can be written, they can be unwritten, they can be codified or not, and policies exist for different purposes. So for the purposes of this particular presentation, we're going to work on policies that are regularized, that really are responsive to a large set of activities, large structures, large procedures, but also procedures that are somewhat commonly known. So we're going to take a look at an example that might be more familiar than most, the judicial system and the police system, and then a second example that we will turn up and we will have a look at somewhat later. So the second situation basically is a very, very complicated situation or issue which characterizes the flow of prenatal and delivery childcare, both for the infant as well for the mother. But first of all, we'll take a look at the sequence of events in the criminal justice system. This is somewhat more well known to many people in the population than others, and it's very interesting. I have a lot of students who really want to engage in some kind of comprehensive change in criminal justice. And so my first response to them often is, well, where do you want to begin? And their response is, well, we've seen Law and Order, or we've seen a police procedural show, so we basically know that the criminal justice system is comprised of arrest and sentencing and appearing before a judge. And of course, as this particular chart shows, it's a very simplified view of a case flow through a criminal justice system, through the criminal justice system of the United States. And so this is not as much to deter students as to educate people as to the complexity of the criminal justice system. From entry into the system, there are several steps, followed by prosecution and pretrial services, by adjudication, by sentencing and sanctions, and by corrections. Juvenile offenders have their own particular approach or direction in the criminal justice system, but as one takes a look at it, it's very complicated. It's also complicated to determine what kind of policy students want to engage in and where along the lines you want to provide some sort of response for change. Is it system entry? Is it in prosecution? Is it adjudication, sentencing and sanctions, or corrections? It's very complicated. And charts like this serve to underscore and to demonstrate visually the complexity of systems that students may want to change. I had another student who was working with an issue or a system that was really very complicated. She didn't quite know how to present it or how to talk about it. And so we came up with ways for her to visualize it or to present this. This was very interesting because despite our best efforts, we were simply unable to come up with a case flow model that really looked at the experiences of mom's care during prenatal, during labor and delivery in a particular system. And so my student wanted to come up with a very simple way of showing to individuals, both at the policy level as well as the consumer community level, why this issue was relatively invisible, but why it was also very complicated. So she talked about and she demonstrated the realities, and this is what we know. So she talked about the continuum of care for prenatal care, which is pretty straightforward. And the question was, how much care do moms get? We know how much care children get or infants get during the pregnancy process. And so instead of trying to visualize a very, very complicated system, what the student actually did was to try to really break it down into some initial processes. And this is an interesting approach, and I want to talk more about that. So you can see that the first step was really to think about simply looking at prenatal care. What was the experience of prenatal care by gestational weeks? So we have here from 4 to 41 gestational weeks, and the big red stop signs indicate the likelihood that there's no particular contact or engagement of the mom in the prenatal care. Oh, congratulations, you're pregnant. Let's make sure that baby is taken care of, that baby is growing. And so turns out that the prenatal care fact sheet produced by the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Women's Health, really recommends that the number of prenatal care visits is about once monthly for weeks 4 to 28, and then more so for weeks 28 to 36, and then weekly for 36 to birth. So there are approximately 16 visits with the OBGYN during the course of pregnancy. And this, of course, assumes that the women find out extremely early on that they are indeed pregnant and that this is actually pregnancy and not problematic menstruation. And there's also a 4-week time frame when pregnancies can or cannot be detected. So there's not an awful lot of time for a mother to get engaged, for a mother to get involved in the prenatal care. Well, the result is that the focus is really on the baby and not so much on the mother at all. So that's prenatal care. So the student basically concluded that in the process of prenatal care, mom doesn't get seen very much at all. And then, of course, she would say, well, but then this does get complicated because now we are looking at labor and delivery and recovery. And so she also wanted to know, well, fine, well, how much care do mothers get at this time? Do they get any care? And if so, what does that look like? And what she found out was that, well, really, there's not an awful lot of care that mom gets at all. There's a recovery process, and then after the recovery process, what we do find is that there is a kind of a welcome to motherhood. So I'm going to view this particular project through the lenses of one of my students who actually struggled to create a visual representation of the healthcare system during pregnancy through postpartum. Why? Because it really varies widely. And she was particularly focused on the experience of Medicaid-eligible African-American women. And she wanted to make the case, both to other students in the class, but also to herself, that these women who were pregnant intersected by mandate because they were required with other domains from a political kind of perspective, geographically and intergenerationally. And her goal was to really map the experience out by the timelines. And she wanted to show what systems were interacting with the woman at any given time point. But what she came up with was the fact that this was really, really hard to do, and there wasn't any simple diagram that, like the diagram of the criminal justice system, looked at all of the trajectories and looked at all the individual components from beginning to end in a relatively static way. This was much more dynamic. And so what the student actually did, partially my suggestion, is to start looking at component parts. And so, well, what does component parts mean? Well, the first thing that we did is to suggest to her that she simply map out prenatal care. So let's look at the prenatal care and let's talk about, within the context of prenatal care, the amount of care time that mom would get. And so she found out, looking at the healthcare fact sheet or the prenatal care fact sheet from the Office of Women's Health, Department of Health and Human Services of the U.S., that the prenatal care visits moved generally from twice monthly or once a month for weeks 4 through 28, and then twice a month from weeks 38 to 36, and then weekly going forward. So that optimally there might be 16 visits with their OBGYN during the course of the pregnancy. But it doesn't factor out, early notification of pregnancy on the part of the mom and making sure that the changes in menstruation might be a result of pregnancy or something else. And then there is even the concern and the ability that it's sometimes difficult to detect pregnancy for 4 weeks. But beyond that, there's no counseling, there's no information, there's no discussion of what issues might exist for the mom. The focus is there on the unborn child. Also, this particular kind of timeline presupposes that once detected or even once suspicions arise, that the mothers are able to schedule an appointment to be tested or receive prenatal care immediately. And as the student was very, very clearly aware, when we look at the other factors involved in this timeline throughout prenatal through pediatric care, those expectations simply are non-existent. She then moved to identifying and charting out delivery and pediatric care and charting the process then, where the thought was, well, mom is going to probably get some kind of care, or does mom get any care throughout this particular aspect? And the answer, once again, is that it really appeared that after a kind of a welcome to motherhood, the focus, while it was on recovery, the focus was still largely on the delivery of the newborn. So the focus was with the newborn. So on the one hand, mother gets no information. I think the gray cloud also suggests that there is usually the notion of postpartum depression, and that appears to be the only time that mother gets some attention to make sure that that postpartum depression isn't coming in the way of breastfeeding, of regular care for the infant, and ensuring that she gets all of the visits with the OBGYN. Any sorts of feelings of hopelessness, of incompetence, which often mothers parenting in poverty may express much more so than their better prepared and well-resourced counterparts, raises that. And given that the thought is, or the expectation is, well, there would need to be more resources, more efforts, more activities for the mother's benefit. But even then, that continues to be a problem. So what we see is that mothers who are parenting in poverty have to navigate a variety of resources while they are also becoming new mothers. So in addition to the routine trips for pediatric care, mothers often have to navigate TANF, WIC, Family Medical Leave Acts, which may involve, well, you're able to take time off without being paid. In addition to pediatric care and the NICU, there's also child care, which is expensive. There's also transportation to and from work, to and from child care, and what happens to employment opportunities. FMLA may or may not follow and may not be available in the workplaces for these women. If there's some involvement with criminal justice, either on the part of the woman herself or of the child's father, there's also the involvement of that particular process. After that, there's a navigation of Medicaid. And also, not too often, not surprisingly, if the woman is having extreme distress in working with child, more often than not, CPS may be called in to investigate that. Add to that education, and what you have, women who are working class, who are parenting in poverty, navigate not one, not two, but multiple systems of care which don't communicate to each other. And that's the expectation that they find a way to get all of these services for the baby. And oh, by the way, in very, very small respect for themselves. My student ended up by saying, who's the advocate for the mother, especially if she's having concerns about being a prepared and equipped parent? Where does she go? And that was a presentation that she emerged with, and it was an extraordinarily complicated presentation. Going to the end of this particular presentation, the critical takeaway is that the process of visualizing policies can be helpful in identifying what kinds of policy change might be engaged with or might be considered, where and at what time, and with respect to what person. This concludes this very brief presentation on visualizing social policy. Thank you very much.